because this is the microphone that you'll be using to ask your questions. I'm glad that it's working. Just a very warm welcome from the Cambridge City Group of Amnesty International. We're hosting this event, but together with Global Justice Now, the People's Assembly and Oxfam, representatives from all those organisations here. There has been a committee from all the organisations choosing the questions, really so that there isn't too much overlap and we get a broad spread of questions.
Can you hold the microphone further from your mouth?
Is that better? Yes. Less echoey. All right, so this is a sample, this is how not to do it and how to do it when it's your question. Okay. I'm actually the treasurer of the local group, so please forgive me if I make an appeal right now for our bucket collection at the end. The hiring of the church does cost quite a bit. We didn't want to charge any entrance fee. We wanted everybody to be able to come. So please do give something if you can at the end towards the cost of hiring the venue. Local Amnesty group, very active. Amnesty constantly in the news, and sadly, human rights activism is needed as much as it ever was. Some of you might have heard Kate Allen on the radio today talking about, because it's the anniversary of the disappearance of 220 plus girls in Nigeria, taken by Boko Haram, and Amnesty actually says that 2,000 overall, according to their research, has been taken. So most people have heard about that. There are other places that Amnesty does research for, in fact research all over the world, and a special mention for Kashmir, because we had a speaker at our meeting last week, a very moving speaker on Kashmir, and the appalling things that are happening there, torture and rape and so on. Very little heard about in the press, but Amnesty is keeping that alive. And I mention that particularly because on the 29th of April, please do come at 5 o'clock if you can. There's a film being shown and a talk by the director Jitha Neumann about his film about torture in Kashmir. It's being held in King's College in the King's Theatre. The group meets every month, second Thursday in the month at 7:30 at the Quaker Meeting House. We also have regular stall in the market, we have events like this, concerts and so on. We also have a letter writing meeting. We have subgroups, really because of the specialisms of people in our group. Amnesty does try very much to cover the world, but our particular group has subgroups on LGBTI, on anti-death penalty, on anti-torture, and on the Colombia peace community, a growing village, or series of villages in Colombia trying to stand up against the drug traffickers, the army, the rebels, the quasi-military groups there. And also one of our members specialises in children's rights. So if you're at all interested, there's no need to sign up to everything. Come to any meeting you're interested in. Please do join our Facebook, our Twitter, and sign on to our newsletter. And the same goes for the other organisations, and everything that's there for them. I'm going to hand over straight away. That's enough for me to Dottie McLeod, who's very kindly come from Radio Cambridgeshire to chair our meeting, and she'll explain exactly what's going to happen.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm Dottie McLeod, I present the breakfast show on the BBC Radio Cambridgeshire. Thank you all very much for coming along, and thank you as well to the organisations who are running this event for inviting me. In terms of the format, we're going to go straight to your questions, so getting right into the issues straight away. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer each question. I would say that longer doesn't necessarily mean better, so don't feel you have to use the full 2 minutes. If your question is called, then a microphone will make its way to you. Please, once you have asked your question, return your microphone for the roving microphone holder. Just a few notices. If you're going to follow the debate on Twitter, then the hashtag, which has been agreed by all the candidates, is AmnestyCan. Toilets are through that door. You have fire exits, again, through that door,
and that way as well. And as Sarah just mentioned, no charge for entry, and there will be a bucket collection at the end. So, who do you see before you? On my far left is Chamali Fernando, representing the Conservatives. Chamali was born in the East Midlands, studied for her politics A-level here in Cambridge, and is a qualified barrister. To my left here, Julian Huppert of the Liberal Democrats, grew up in Cambridge, has represented the city since 2010 in the House of Commons, a doctor of biological chemistry, spent time as a research scientist, and also served as a Cambridgeshire County Councillor for 8 years. To my right is Rupert Reid of the Green Party, also an academic background, a reader in philosophy at the University of East Anglia, based between Norwich and Cambridge, and also runs a think tank called Greenhouse. And to my far left, Daniel Zeichner of the Labour Party, used to work in IT, at one point ran his own company, also a councillor for 8 years and a Cambridge United supporter, as you could tell by the scarf if you saw him walk in. So let's dive straight into the questions, and we start today with Aidan Baker.
Question is simply this: should aid money, overseas aid money, be spent on promoting energy privatisation?
Okay, so Jamal, if you'd like to start.
I'm very proud actually that we have a continued commitment to overseas aid. I would prefer to see that it is spent on projects such as helping secure better justice and fairness. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me at the back. Secure fairness and justice and stability in the country, rather than it be spent on energy. But at one point, we don't get the chance to dictate how that money is spent. And maybe as an international body, we can start to talk about those things. But at the moment, once we give that aid, it is up to those countries as to how they spend it. So I'm absolutely committed to our history as a country in terms of international aid. And we have been the first government to achieve our Millennium Development Goals, so I'm very proud of that as well.
Julian Huppert.
Well, thank you. It's really good to see you, Aidan. It's good to see everybody here for such an important set of issues. To pick up this issue about aid, we made a commitment as a country in 1970 to spend 0.7% of our GNI on international development aid. But we never, ever bothered to do it. And it's only a couple of years ago under this government that we finally actually hit that 0.7% target. I'm really proud of that. It's one of the reasons I got into politics in the first place, was international human rights. I'm also really pleased that we managed to pass a private members bill. I was one of the co-sponsors of it, was led by my then colleague Mike Moore, which will write that into law, so that all future governments will have to do that. No other major country has ever kept that commitment. And I think that's really, really important, something I'm very proud of, we should all be very proud of as a country. To come to your question about what happened to that money, it should be much more about capacity building rather than driving a particular agenda around energy. I would like to see a lot to do with, for example, renewables and trying to help people to go down what we now see as the right path. I also would like to see much more about energy efficiency, because anywhere in the world, using less energy is better for the environment and better locally than any way of generating it. So, very proud about the aid. We do need to make sure it's used for the right purposes.
Rupert Reid of Greens.
Hello, yes, a great pleasure to be here at this important event and to have a chance to answer this important question. The answer is straightforward, it is no. I'll just add a little bit to that, which is this. The real issue, of course, lying in the background here is the pressures that are on developing countries to go down the road of privatisation in the first place, the broader pressures. And those are crucially to do with what's called, some of you will know this term, conditionality, the way that various organisations, including the IMF and the World Bank, seek to force developing countries to privatise parts of their economy in return for them getting loans, aid, in return for them being considered as good citizens of the world. And this has to stop. And we in the Green Party believe passionately that developing countries must be left to find their own way, must be helped better than we've been helping them to find that way. We in the Greens would raise the amount of foreign aid to 1% of GDP. And most crucially of all, must not have conditions imposed upon them that make it impossible for them to do so, and must not have their very conditions of life stripped away from them by, for example, dangerous climate change and other threats that we are complicit in, which make it very, very difficult for them to survive, let alone develop and catch up to some extent with us. So the answer to the question is no, but there's a broader picture. We need to stop the broader pressures that there are on these developing economies to privatise. That pressure needs to be turned around.
And Daniel Zeichner.
I think the answer is no as well. I think it's a very good question because I think it goes to the heart of what we understand development to be about, and there will be people in the room who are probably more expert on these issues than any of us on the panel. But my sense is, I was very proud of the last Labour government's international development programme. I think that Claire Short, Hilary Benn and Douglas Alexander were all highly respected Secretaries of State. And one of the things I think they tried to do through that period with DFID was really widen the whole concept of what development was about. It wasn't just about aid. It was about conflict resolution, it was about tackling inequality, it was about justice, it was about particularly working with women and children. Now, what also was happening at the time, of course, was a lot of pressure on coming from corporates. I should say I work for Unison, the National Trade Union, which has a strong international section, strong department. And I've spent a lot of time working with my colleagues, putting pressure on the last Labour government to step away from some of this pressure to privatise. We talk about public partnerships rather than public-private partnerships. And I think one thing that's happened in the last 5 years, I'm afraid, the balance has shifted. And I think now it is now far too much about developing effectively the pressure to privatise rather than the broader agenda I'm talking about. So I would certainly like to see that balance shifted back.
Thank you very much all, and thank you to Aidan for that question. Our second question comes, and forgive me, I'm struggling to read the writing a little bit. Is it Muriel or Muriel? Muriel? Muriel. Oh, are you Muriel? Here we are. Lovely. The microphone is on its way to you, Muriel.
Would you support prisoners being allowed to vote?
A very good question. Would you support prisoners being allowed to vote? Rupert Reed, would you like to kick us off with that one?
The answer, once again, is straightforward. It is yes. And the reason is this. What prison is about is not just about punishing people or deterring people, those kinds of purposes. It is also crucially about reintegrating people back into society. Now, how can we hope to reintegrate criminals back into society if we forbid them from even the merest involvement in that society while they are in prison? I think the argument, therefore, is pretty straightforward, QED. There is an objection which is sometimes made. People say, well, yes, but what if you had a whole load of prisoners all voting for some, terrible, corrupt person to become their MP or something like that? I really think that's a bad idea. Hope ridiculously overblown. It would only become at all a kind of worry if we had hundreds of thousands of people in prison, if the prison population was a significant chunk of our population. And that, of course, raises a worry. The prison population has been rising. That raises a broader issue. Should all of these people be in prison in the first place? And our belief in the Green Party is that some of them should not. And that actually we need to look much more seriously at alternatives to prison. We need to look at ways of reintegrating criminals with those who they've offended against restorative justice programs have been shown to work in many cases. Circles of support have been shown to work, for example, even with regards to very difficult cases such as child abuse. I'm familiar with this from my background in the Quakers. So the answer to the, if you will, broader underlying question is that it's not just that prisoners should be allowed to vote, but there shouldn't be so many people who are prisoners in the first place. We should be trying to reintegrate people into society before they get to be thrown in prison.
Chimani Fernando for the Conservatives.
Actually, my answer is very different. I don't think prisoners should have the right to vote. I've been a barrister now for 12 years, and I grew up in a family where my father was a solicitor, and I have come across from a very young age people who have either committed crimes or been accused of committing a crime. and I started visiting prisons soon after I qualified to see clients and see the conditions in those prisons. There is much to be said about rehabilitative justice and restorative justice, and I think that we haven't got it right in terms of prisons, but I don't think the answer is to go down the route of giving prisons the right to vote, because I think it would lead to some peculiar electoral results, and more importantly, we struggle in this country with getting people who have their liberty, with getting them to vote. And I think we need to do something about voter apathy. So your question goes to two issues as far as I can see. One is, how do we rehabilitate prisoners? And I think there are a raft of measures that I would look at in terms of rehabilitation. I'll just give one example. At the moment, if you have committed a crime, you have to disclose that on your future job application. And so you might have committed a crime, let's say 5 years ago, a dishonesty offence. You apply for a job and you have to disclose that. Now, in some circumstances, if you're handling money, you would argue, yes, that's right, you should disclose this dishonesty offence. But at what stage do we start saying on employment application forms, right, this is enough time, this conviction has been spent, so it's more than 10 years old, do you still really have to disclose it? Or can we come up with a system, for example, if you undertake a particular course, that you don't have to therefore disclose a conviction that is more than 10 years old? Because that is the biggest problem. Just very, very quickly, people can't get jobs when they get back into society, and that's what holds them back.
Jumani Fernando there. Daniel Zeichen, the Labour Party.
Well, this of course is a very complicated and controversial issue, and caused I think quite a difficult set of decisions when it came up in Parliament recently. And can I say, I congratulate Julian for being brave on this one and voting with his conscience. I have to say, the vast majority of members of Parliament in the end, I think, came to the conclusion that prisoners shouldn't have votes. My view is that it depends on your definition of prisoner, how serious the crime has been. In my view, there are far too many people who are in prison at the moment who probably shouldn't be there, and I think depriving them of voting is quite wrong. But when there are very, very serious offences, I do understand why the people who have been victims of those crimes do feel very strongly about this. So it's a complicated argument. I think on balance, I'm probably in a different position from most of my party, in the sense that it seems to me it's two separate things. Depriving someone of their liberty and putting them in prison is one punishment. Then depriving them of their civil right to participate in a democracy is an additional punishment. And if you're not clear about that at the beginning, then it seems to me unfair that we've got the situation we've got at the moment. So as I say, it's a complicated set of issues. It raises considerable passions, not least because we're under pressure from the European Court to comply. And that will probably come to some other questions that we come to in a bit. But I think, in the end, I would like to see everyone taking part in our democracy, but I probably would make some exceptions for the most serious crimes.
Quite a spread of views so far. Julian Hubbard.
Well, thank you for that comment, David. I mean, there was a small band of 22 of us who stayed back in order to vote to say that prisoners should be allowed to vote. It was a bunch of Lib Dems, a few principal Labour people, a couple of people from the minor parties, I don't know the exact numbers, and we were massively, massively defeated. The bulk of Labour and of the Conservatives was very clear that prisoners should not be allowed to vote. I disagree completely with that, for all the reasons we articulated. Why should we punish people by depriving them of their citizens' rights because they've committed some sort of offence? It just doesn't make sense. What I find really interesting, because I've sometimes been accused of not really understanding prisons or prisoners, is that prison governors think that prisoners should be allowed to vote. And there aren't many people who are keen on it, who know more about prisons than prison governors. And just before that vote, I went with a colleague to visit, I should be careful not to say which prison, where I think one of us mentioned his vote power, and the governor was showing something incredibly hostile. Visibly hostile. Until I told them that I thought they should be allowed to vote, at which point he completely relaxed. Prison governors are absolutely clear. People suggest there are logistical problems. There are no logistical problems. Prisoners who are on remand are already allowed to vote. So if one type of prisoner can vote from a prison, why can't another type of prisoner vote from a prison? I think Ruth was also right, though, to say that the real question is why there are so many people in prisons in the first place. We have to massively reduce that number. We have in this last Parliament Chris Grayling has a slightly different view of criminal justice from mine, but we have, just to say the least, but we have managed to halve the number of young people in custody. And actually that's something I'm really, really proud of. We need to get other numbers down for women, for men, because there should be much more. So my party manifesto is coming out tomorrow. We like to see a presumption against short sentences, because short sentences are the very worst sentences that there are. Because they make it very, very hard for people to get jobs. Charlie's right on that. They are very expensive. They are incredibly detrimental. So fewer people in prison, and yeah, let's let them know it.
Okay, just a quick note to keep a little bit of time. A few answers starting to run over the 2-minute limit. Again, the longest answer is not always the best one. Mariel, thank you very much for the question. The next one comes from Richard Taylor. He's over here. You can see him. Should say, partly just to fill the time on the microphone makes its way over, we do have Richard and also Anthony who are filming the event. They are only filming us lot up on the stage, so don't worry, no one's face is going to be plastered all over YouTube in the morning. Richard Taylor.
Should the UK offer Edward Snowden asylum, a medal, a fair trial?
Thank you, Richard. Multiple choice then. We will start with Julian Hubbard.
I think he should be offered asylum. I mean, I think it was an astonishing thing which he did. It's a great shame that he felt he had to go through that route rather than there being proper due process within the US. But I think to leave him sort of stranded in Russia is not the best outcome at all. And it's really amazing what we learned from Snowden. I mean, I spent about a year working on a very detailed committee looking at the communications data bills to do this charge as it became called. And we were told all sorts of things, which we then learned from Snowden, were not remotely accurate. That as parliamentarians, we were lied to by the security services and the police about what could happen. But when that came out, it was really terrifying how little reaction there was in the UK Parliament. We had one debate, the debate which I secured with cross-party support, one debate only. Huge number of people resisting, disagreeing. People not wanting to talk about what we come across. In Germany there's been lots of discussion, in the US there's been lots of discussion. But here, uniquely, there's been very, very little. I don't know why there's, in Germany they have the experience of the Stasi, America's more experience of the FBI going on, we have experience of James Bond. We think it's all James Bond. But in fact, there have been huge ones. And in fact, the government lost the first case ever in front of the IPT, the tribunal which deals with intelligence matters, where they ruled that, in fact, the regime that we had was not lawful. It's been corrected, so it's now technically lawful. But it was ruled to be not lawful. Now, I think we have to have a role for the security agencies. They do play a very important role in keeping us safe. But they have to stick within the law. There has to be support for proper oversight. And there has to be support for whistleblowers internally, so we wouldn't have to force somebody like Snowden to go through the steps he's had to go through.
So one tick for asylum so far. Let's go to Daniel Session.
Well, I'm not quite so keen on Snowden as you are, Julian, because I think he did put a huge number of people at risk. But what he did, of course, reveal was that there were dreadful things going on, and that is the dilemma. And we absolutely do have to protect whistleblowers. This is almost on a completely different scale, isn't it? Which is why it's been such an extraordinary case, and why it's so very, very difficult to resolve. So I think it's a very hard one for people to deal with. And I find myself absolutely torn, because in principle I think it is, for an individual to make that decision, it's a very momentous decision to take. And it must have been a momentous decision for him to take, because not only did he put others at risk, he also put himself at huge risk. His whole life has been, of course, you could say, transformed because of it, and never been the same again. So in some ways you can say he was very brave, but you can also say he was very foolish. So it's a very, very hard one. And I think the biggest problem of all is what it showed, what it revealed. And we have to look very carefully at how we deal with that in future. But we also shouldn't understate the risks that we do face in the modern world. So it's a question of getting the balances right. I'm not sure that Richard's question is easily answerable, quite frankly, and I think that's probably why he finds himself in a state of limbo.
Jemima Fernando.
I actually think he's been incredibly brave, and we should stand up for people who've done that. Sorry. the reality is we are fortunate in this country to have whistleblowing legislation to protect the whistleblower. I think in the case of Snowden, we have uncovered atrocities going on that we would never have otherwise known about. So it sets the wheels of transparency in motion. It gives people the courage to come forward and talk about things that they know that are going on that we would not otherwise know about. So I think he's done very well. In answer to the question, I am torn between asylum. I don't think we need to go as far as a medal, but he has been incredibly brave.
And finally on this one, Rupert Reed.
Well, why not asylum and the medal? Julian, the only question I have for you is, why were you surprised that the spooks lied to you? I mean, that's what they do. That's what they do, and they've got far too much power, and they're dangerous. And I must say, I'm disturbed by Daniel's answer to the question. I'm afraid that when push comes to shove, Labour's instincts, like the Conservatives' instincts on these questions, always seem to be in the final analysis to plug for the deep state and to expose us all to ever-growing levels of surveillance. And I think we need to be extremely disturbed by what Snowden and others have revealed. We are in a situation now in a country like this and also in the US where in many ways the level of surveillance, the extent to which we are a police state is more than it was in Eastern Europe. The amount of stuff that they know about us, the amount of ways that they snoop upon us are stuff that the Stasi in many respects could only dream of. And yet we tolerate this. It's extremely disturbing. One reason I feel about this very strongly is because I have quite a lot of friends and colleagues in the Green Party, outside the Green Party, and other radical movements like the animal rights movement and so on, who have been spied upon and dealt with in most disturbing and appalling ways in some cases. My friend and colleague, Baroness Jenny Jones, is coming here in 10 days' time to support my campaign and speak for us in this election. Jenny is someone who has been labelled, according to secret police documents that were revealed, as a domestic extremist because of various demonstrations that she's taken part in. Now, of course, the great response to this is always, well, if you've got nothing to hide, then what are you afraid of? But let me tell you, there are people who do have something to hide. Journalists often have something to hide. Whistleblowers often have something to hide. Political activists often have something to hide. Right? This idea that you've got nothing to hide, then what are you afraid of, is completely wrong. And of course, it applies directly to Snowden himself. He had something to hide. Right? He had something therefore to be afraid of. Thankfully, he managed to keep his courage and reveal it all to us. The world's a better place for it.
Rupert, thank you very much. We're varying the order, by the way, just so that they don't get too comfortable, and also so the same person doesn't end up always having to go first. Sheila. Where is Sheila? Here she is. Some great questions, by the way.
Would you abolish the Human Rights Act? And if so, what message does this send to the rest of the world?
And we will start this time with Daniel Zeichler.
Thank you. That's a very easy one. Absolutely not. And of course, it was Labour who incorporated the European Convention of Human Rights into UK law, and we are absolutely clear that we will be keeping it. There are things that do need to be reformed in terms of the European Court, but I actually ask you to look at the threat that we face at the moment. Because if the Conservatives win the election in 4 weeks' time, then this is very much on the agenda, that we will be pulling out of those agreements. And the lesson, the message it sends to the rest of the world, I'd say is twofold. One is that we are pulling in, and of course this is also linked to the other European issue, the question of the future of our place in the European Union. But we're looking inwards. We're no longer prepared to offer leadership in the world. Remember, these human rights issues, we led. This is something that Britain set up and established. We should be proud of it. And this notion that somehow we are constrained by it, I'm astonished by the Conservatives' position on this. When a natural Conservative should be lauding the praises of these rights which protect people against an intrusive state. But they've got completely into the wrong place. And the last election, Hustings, we were actually asked, each of us, which of the politicians we most admired in another party. At the time, I rather jokingly said Ken Livingstone, because although he was in my party, he wasn't very helpful to me. But now, if I was asked, I'd say Dominic Reeve, because I think he's a decent Tory who lost his job because he stood up for this. And I think it is so, so wrong, and I'm very sorry that he's not featuring nearly enough in this election campaign. But be clear, if Labour wins in 4 weeks' time, he's safe with us.
Let's get the Green Party view on this from Rupert Reed.
Well, I agree with Daniel, and I'm going to keep this one very, very short. It's a yes or no question. The answer is no. There is no good argument for abolishing the Human Rights Act or deincorporating it. Simple as that.
Making our way along the table, Julian Hubbard.
I agree with that. You know, the Human Rights Act is an essential part of this country. I would absolutely keep it. We fought in the last 5 years to make sure it stayed, despite the best efforts of the Tories. The Human Rights Act is a great thing, and congratulations to Labour for bringing it in. It was a good achievement from them. They didn't always act as though they remembered it existed, detaining children for immigration purposes and all that sort of thing. But it was a very, very important thing. And I'm also surprised that the Tories don't want to act. I used to be on the National Council of Liberty with Shami Chakrabarti, and obviously this is something which we were quite keen on. There's a great book that came out, Churchill's Greatest Legacy. Because the European Convention on Human Rights was Britain saying to the rest of Europe, after the war, here are the basic British standards we think you should live up to. For us to say that we want to go below the basic standards that we had is pretty atrocious, pretty horrific. The list of countries in Europe that are not part of the convention is Belarus. Is that a club we want to be part of? Surely not. Now, there's been a big problem because the Daily Mail and other papers like that have managed to badge human rights as being human rights for terrorists, human rights for criminals. Now, personally, I think terrorists and criminals shouldn't have human rights. They're human. But it's been badged that way, and we need to talk more about how human rights help people. They help people live with decency and care homes. They help people not to be spied on by the state. They help with so many things in our daily lives. And then to ask the question, go through the list of rights, which is the one that you don't think we should have? We should get rid of the right not to be tortured? We shouldn't allow free expression? Which one is it? We have to keep the Human Rights Act.
Julian, thank you, and a special welcome to any Belarusians in the room. Chimani.
Thank you, Sheila, for the question. I actually think it's a lot more complex than is made out. Having been a barrister, as I've said, I have dealt with legislation involving the Human Rights Act and articles from the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think there are areas where we can improve. I feel that there are some brilliant enshrined articles, such as Article 3, in terms of freedom from inhumane treatment and torture and degrading treatment, and also Article 6, the right to a fair trial. However, what I will be campaigning for is a British Bill of Rights. I feel it's not about abolishing one and not having anything thereafter. I feel that we have a very established legal system in this country which prides itself on fairness and justice. And I believe that we can come up with a set of rights ourselves which are fit for purpose. And that's the problem at the moment with the Human Rights Act. It is not fit for purpose. You do get some bonkers decisions in court as a result of the application of the Human Rights Act. So I'd like to see a British Bill of Rights. I don't want a situation where we have nothing. I think it's very important to have rights for humans, and whether that be enshrined in the British Bill of Rights or the Human Rights Act, it's important that something's there. But the key point is it should be fit for purpose.
Jamal Fernando there for the Conservatives, finishing us off on that question. Dave Brokenshire. Here he is.
How do you think a future British government ought to respond to the day-to-day human rights abuses against Palestinians committed by Israel both in its own territory and in the territories it occupies?
Thank you very much, Dave. And we are going to go straight back to Chimali to start with.
Thank you very much, Dave, for that question. Again, it's another complex issue. I feel that Firstly, we ought to respect the territorial integrity of states, but at the same time, in Britain we have a great tradition of being actors on a global stage in terms of securing stability and peace. However, we can't just go to another country or impose our law on another country. We have to work with...
If we could let her answer the question first of all, we may be able to take secondary questions in a moment, but Jemima, continue.
Thank you. I feel that we actually have to work with actors on the ground and with government and with civic society to try and reach a peaceful settlement. And I believe in a two-state solution, and I think that it's not just about us coming along and saying, right, well, this is the answer to your problems. It's actually about going there and trying to win hearts and minds and say, well, look, we can help you. This is how we think we can help you. So we haven't got it right in terms of Palestine. No country's got it right so far, and I think there's a lot of work to be done in that regard.
I can tell this is a question that a lot of people in the room are very interested in. So Dave, what I'm going to do is we're going to go down all of the candidates, and then if you have a sort of secondary question, we'll come back to you. Is that all right? Lovely. Who's next on my list? Julian Hammond.
What's happening in Israel and Palestine is absolutely atrocious. It is a complete disgrace. I've spoken out about this on many, many occasions. Sadly, there's been too many opportunities to speak out about the abuses. And roughly 5 years ago, before the election, I promised that if elected, I would go to Gaza and see for myself what it was like. And later that year in 2010, I did go to Gaza and talk to human rights campaigners in Gaza about what it was like. And it really broke my heart to see what was happening. It's not, by the way, just Israelis abusing Palestinians' human rights. Essentially, everybody managed to abuse everybody's human rights there, which is a huge problem. And Israel's policies have been so spectacularly self-defeating that even if you were trying to get what was best for Israel, you wouldn't be doing what happens now. It just makes matters worse. So we have to have a complete change. You can see the article we wrote afterwards, there's lots of things on it. So we have to take much firmer steps against the illegal armed settlements. You know, that is not okay. That is illegal under international law. We should take further steps on arms sales. If Israel's going to use those weapons to attack people, that should not be something which we do. We should recognise Palestine. I voted for that very clearly. We have to build up a real Palestine, which has independence, which can develop its own approaches. We have to help to train up political leaders there, so there is a good selection of people around. I had hoped that the latest Israeli elections would show that people within Israel were seeing the beginnings of a change, because there are peaceniks in Israel, there are voices within Israel who are trying to change. And the tragic re-election of Netanyahu, and some of the comments that he made before those elections were just disgraceful. It's a really complex mission. In fact, last time I was here in this hall was for an Amnesty event with a man called Omar, who was a Druze refused to be conscripted. It's a very, very complex position. But we as a country are partly responsible for what happened there, with how we messed up during the mandate. So we have to take action to build a proper Palestine where people's human rights are respected.
Why do you want the all-party for Palestine?
We will take secondary questions just once all of the candidates have had a chance to speak. Bear with us if you can for a moment, sir. Daniel Zeichen.
It's so pressing, isn't it? Because this has been one of those issues that all my lifetime has been staying in the international community. I was an anti-apartheid activist campaigning to end the apartheid regime in South Africa, and one, I guess, lives in hope that we're going to see a similar breakthrough at some stage with Palestine. And the situation is horrible, dreadful. It's illegal, that's the point. And it's another failure of the United Nations, I'm afraid. And it shows how difficult it is, given that we've got to operate within international law, what to do when the United Nations doesn't work. Now, there are some basic things. I very much agree with much of what Julian said. I found the Israeli elections particularly depressing, so I think there was a glimmer of hope, and that has been extinguished at the moment. I think the vote on Palestinian statehood is important. Labour's absolutely committed to that. We'll take that forward. But I think in the end, my view is that the only way you're going to solve it in the end is through negotiation. And that's painstaking, it's slow, it's probably going to need figures in the region to come forward and actually work with people. Because I just don't see there's any other obvious way forward. It's the way most of these disputes in the end get resolved. But that's going to mean long-term capacity building, and it's going to mean patience. And I quite understand why people look at it and say, why should people be patient looking at the horrors that people are suffering at the moment? So I can't offer a ready solution to this. I think if anybody in the world could, they would immediately be hailed as a great saviour. But we've got to work with the good, positive people and try and find a negotiated solution for those people.
Andrew Reid.
In politics, you know you're getting somewhere when you get a death threat. I received my first death threat as a result of my pro-Palestinian activism some years ago. This was some years ago. It was a good old-fashioned death threat with little bits of paper cut out and stuck onto a letter that was then sent to me anonymously. This is an issue I feel very passionately about and have campaigned on for a long time, and I want to invite you to listen very carefully to what I'm saying about it relative to what the other parties are saying about it, because Daniel and Julian may talk a good talk on this, but you really need to listen very carefully for the punchline. And the punchline is this: unless there are serious measures to force Israel to the negotiating table, it is never going to happen. So that's why in the Green Party Manifesto published today, we have said that the EU-Israel Trade Association Agreement should be suspended. The EU is now Israel's main trading partner, not the US. We need to end the occupation. That is non-negotiable, and it's not going to happen unless there are economic sanctions. That is not going to be offered to you by any of the other candidates at this election. There is a very clear choice here on this issue. I do invite you to think about it. Thank you.
So clearly a question about which there's lots of interest in the room. Dave, you asked the question initially. Do you have a secondary question, having heard people's responses?
Well, yes. I don't have a... Rupert Reid has talked about the necessity for sanctions. Nobody else has said anything that has implied anything about putting pressure on Israel. I'd like to remind them that in the past year, when we saw over 2,000 people slaughtered in Gaza, the British spent over £12 million on arms sales to Israel, as it's recently been revealed. The British Prime Minister has said that, we need to support Israel's right to defend itself. It was not defending itself. It was pure aggression. Its actions in the occupied territories are not defence, they are aggression. Any people has the right to defend itself against an invading, occupying power. This is completely understood in international law. I am quite frankly horrified that most of the panel can't see this. And, frankly, I was hoping better for all of you. Well, with the exception of the Greens.
Dave, thank you. Given this sort of a point rather than a question, we'll go to the gentleman at the back who had a question in the middle of those answers. Would you like to ask it once again?
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Semple, I have a puzzle that you expressed this concern for Palestine, and I'm not actually on the party parliamentary committee about it.
Julian, would you like to respond to that?
Yes.
I didn't hear the question.
The question was, why am I not a member of the all-party parliamentary group on Palestine? To which there is a technical answer, which is that there are no all-party parliamentary groups because Parliament was dissolved, and a more relevant one, which is that I was a member of it. Which is that I was a member of it. Until it was dissolved. And I will happily, if re-elected, I will rejoin it when Parliament comes back. But there are no groups at the moment. I was a member, I will hopefully be a future member.
If we could leave it there, that would be fantastic. I appreciate it's a very emotive issue and clearly a very controversial one as well. Thank you very much for all of your questions on it. But we will move on, otherwise we will cover no other subjects tonight. Ted. I think it says Ted. You could say Ned. Ted. And a little note here that this is also a question asked by a number of other people. So.
When will any of the major parties have the moral courage to do away with trident and nuclear weapons, and what will they do with the billions saved?
Daniel Zeichner.
Well, of course, the world would be a much better place without nuclear weapons, and I think we would all agree with that. The question is, how do you get there? Now, this has been a long-running dispute and debate, obviously, with the Labour Party over many years. My position, I'm afraid, on this is not quite the same as my party's position. The national position is that Labour wants to continue the continuous at-sea deterrent. My view is that spending all that money on renewing Trident isn't a very sensible use of money, and I think there are plenty of people in the defence community who appreciate that and understand that. But I make no bones about it. You know what the Labour Party's position is. I suspect there are many people in this room who would want a different view, and it's my view too.
Rupert Reed.
Well, I'm very happy that the question's been asked. As I say, the Green Party manifesto was launched today, and if you go and read the documents on it, you will find that we spell out in great detail there what we will do with that £100 billion if we're given the chance. That's one of the many ways, of course, in which we're able to offer more than the other parties, right? Because we're prepared to make cuts that they're not prepared to make, cuts of bad things like Trident, and we're prepared to put in taxes that they're not prepared to put in on bad things such as people being excessively wealthy. That's what gives us the money to play with to fully fund the fully costed manifesto we just announced today. So it's an absolutely crucial question, because how can we hold our heads high in the world? How can we look at ourselves in the mirror, frankly, while we are holding in our hands a weapon which the World Court has ruled the very possession of is probably a crime against international law. It's immoral to threaten the use of nuclear weapons, and Trident is a standing threat of use. What kind of message do we send to other countries in the world by holding on doggedly to these weapons? What kind of message do we send to countries like Iran? What kind of message do we send to anybody who is worried about their own future defence? When we say, well, we're going to hold on to ours, but you're not allowed to have any. People talk about multilateral disarmament. Come on, it's so much hot air, right? The only realistic thing we can do with this £100 billion white elephant, because it's not even, by the way, an independent nuclear deterrent, we can't actually run it in any serious way. We can't keep it technically up to date without continuous American assistance. What kind of message does it send that we hold on to this £100 billion threat against the whole of the rest of the world, and we tell them they're not entitled to have it? So, but I end by telling you this. Daniel wants you to elect a majority Labour government. If Ed Miliband is the Prime Minister of a majority Labour government, he will push through Trident, even if there are anti-Trident rebels in the Labour group. He will push it through with Tory support. The only way you can stop Trident in the next Parliament is if you have a substantial phalanx of progressive MPs who are having to prop up that Labour government from the SNP, from Clyde, from the Greens. When I last looked, Clyde and the SNP weren't standing in Cambridge. Thank you.
Shimali Fernando.
I can tell from the round of applause that my comments are going to be unpopular, but what you will get from me is someone who will stand by what they believe in, and I'm not going to come to you and ask you to vote for me and then do something different when I get into Parliament. I'm afraid that I subscribe to the idea that we do need a continuous at-sea deterrent. And we've recently had the Defence Spending Review and the Royal Navy's report suggesting that actually Trident in its current form is not up to the mark of what we need. And actually we're proposing investing in 4 submarines so that we actually do have that continuous deterrent capability.
In what circumstances would you use it?
If we could let Shimali finish.
Ideally, the whole purpose of a deterrent is that it's there as a threat to be used, but we wouldn't use it. But we live in an increasingly volatile world where Russia poses an increasing threat, Syria, Iran. There are threats on our country. We're very lucky in Cambridge. We live, and we're very privileged to live in what I call the Cambridge bubble, where we don't always hear about problems and we don't always face the problems. It's very different when you go to Cambridge Crown Court here to when you go to the Royal Courts of Justice, and I've made this point before. The Royal Courts of Justice in London, you see a sign as you step into that building which tells you what level of alert we're on in the Royal Courts of Justice, whether it's black or red alert. And I don't believe that even that disclosure is the real disclosure of the level of security threat that we face. I think it could be worse, and we are protected thanks to the very good services of our intelligence agencies. I'm sorry, I know it's unpopular, but I'm not going to lie to you. That is my position.
I've always opposed trying to nuclear deterrent. It just does not make any sense at all. We don't need it, we don't want it, and it massively weakens our moral authority to tell other countries they shouldn't have them either. How can you honestly say to a country like Iran, you should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons, but it's fine for us to, because we're good people? How could you possibly say that? I would much rather say, we think these are bad things, they're dangerous things, you shouldn't have them, we shouldn't have them, we want everyone else to get rid of them as well. That strikes me as a much better way to go. It didn't make much sense in the Cold War, there's a reason why it was known as MAD. It doesn't make sense now. I cannot imagine that if a terrorist sets something off here, we're going to respond by blowing up their entire country. I just don't think it's ever going to happen, it's not the right thing to do. Rupert was right that Labour and the Tories both want to try and push it through. The only reason we can have this discussion now, the only reason we haven't already replaced it, is because we said no. It was supposed to have happened at the beginning of this Parliament, 4 or 5 years ago, to go ahead and we tried it. And we stopped that from happening. And I'd like to stop it again. I have voted against trying it. I will continue to do so. In terms of the money, it doesn't liberate quite as much as you'd hope. Partly because I think you ought to find things for people who work on it currently to do otherwise, retraining, that takes some money. But also because we still have lying around in the dockyards the hulks of the Polaris submarines and all sorts of other things with nuclear waste on them. We don't clean them up at the moment, we just wait a bit longer and a bit longer. One of the things I want to do with that 100 million is to get rid of the nuclear hulks that are floating around the harbour. You can then spend the rest of the money on so many things. On new housing, on transport, on environmental measures. Even if you only cared about defence, if that was your only thing, you could spend the money to defend us much better. Trident must definitely be scrapped and not replaced.
And thank you to Ted who asked that question. Next is Jerry. Right at the back, there we go.
Yes. Will you support a tax dodging bill that clamps down on corporate tax evasion, both here in the UK and by UK companies in developing countries?
Jerry, thank you. It's a subject that's been in the news a lot recently. We will start with Julian.
Very short answer, yes. I've actually been working with Oxfam, Christian Aid and a whole lot of others on the tax dodging bill. It will be in our manifesto tomorrow, because it absolutely matters. Nobody should be able to dodge paying the tax they're supposed to do, whether they're a wealthy individual, whether they're a company here or elsewhere. We've made some steps in this government, some gains to be made. There are some loopholes that have been closed. It's collected billions of pounds, but there's way more to go. People are just so incredibly aggressive with the way they will fiddle what's happening. I think it was in Vodafone that was channeling all of their profits to a sort of one-person company in Luxembourg. I think that's the figure. That's clearly not a genuine business thing. That is a fiddle. We have to close those loopholes because it's the right thing to do for this country. People should pay the taxes that are owed. So yes, definitely to a tax dodging bill. I'd like to see it started within the first 100 days or so of Parliament if we can do that. That's certainly what we'll be talking to Oxfam about, and I hope we'll be able to do it.
Thank you. I think I agree with what Julian has said. I think it's a very important question. I absolutely support a tax dodging bill. I also support the need to simplify our tax legislation, and that is actually the biggest problem that we have in this country. The tax statutes, I don't know if anyone is a lawyer in this room, but the tax statutes, there's 6 volumes, and each one is about this thick, written on very flimsy paper. So it gives lawyers an opportunity to make money, and tax advisors and consultants but actually it's not delivering for this country. So simplifying the tax legislation, I'd go one step further. I'd look at some kind of harmonious system between us and Europe at least, and I think that's achievable, so that you don't have companies hiding in European jurisdictions. I'd love to go to the global stage on this, but we've got to get our own legislation right first. I believe we can do it.
Well, it's great to see some consensus breaking out at last on an issue. The tax dodging bill is in the Green Party manifesto that was published this morning. Also, no Trident is in it, which is not going to be in the Lib Dem manifesto tomorrow, unfortunately. So you can't have everything. Well, you can actually have everything in a way if you support the Green Party, because the tax dodging bill, this is an issue on which we've led. This is an issue on which we've led, and it's only the beginning as far as we're concerned. Those of you who are interested in this, want to look at the technicalities, do look into the work that Caroline Lucas, our wonderful MP, has been doing on this with the world expert on it, Richard Murphy, who lives just up the road here in the east of England, and came and gave a talk recently at a Green Party meeting here in Cambridge. What Caroline and Richard and colleagues have been coming up with is ways that are included in the tax dodging bill, but we, as I say, have provisions that would go even further, to rein in thoroughly tax evasion and tax avoidance through more general purpose anti-tax avoidance measures, which basically enable you, rather than having some really kind of long thing with loads and loads of provisions, to have a kind of general purpose thing which catches anybody who can't show that they were absolutely legitimately not paying the tax in question. It puts the onus on the person who hasn't paid the tax, would be a simple way of putting it. So yes to the tax dodging bill, but we can go a lot further. And in the Green Party fully costed manifesto, that money is already being planned to be put to good use.
Definitely yes. And what's interesting is, you've got to ask yourself the question, why would any government, in times particularly of straitened times, not want to do this? And of course, everyone talks the talk. Osborne talked the talk, but nothing really happened. You look at some of the things he announced a few years ago, the projections, the amount of money he was going to pull in, and it's virtually nothing. Now, why is that? Well, the first thing I'd say is you don't collect taxes by sacking tax collectors. That's what they've been doing. It's blatantly obvious you don't do that. Next thing you do is you've got to ask, why aren't they succeeding on this? Well, look who's paying them. The thing is, they're funded by the hedge funds. So there's no surprise they're not really very determined to see it through. Now, some people say, and I can hear it coming, it was the same with New Labour. And I think New Labour was a bit too close to business sometimes. You may have noticed, business isn't quite so keen on Labour now. And I think it's going to be a whole lot easier for us now to really go hard. And I think this is a crucial moment, a crucial time. Elect a Labour government that can actually do it. And Ed Miliband is showing that he's absolutely determined to do it. The announcements the other day on non-DOMs, you know, people said this kind of thing, you can't do that kind of thing. They'll all go. No, they won't. No, they won't. You've got to call their bluff. The same with the tax avoidance. They've got to pay their way. The thing that's changed is that people are now so outraged about the unfairness of all this, and it has been exposed, that now is the opportunity to have a government that can actually do it. And that's the difference between Rupert and me. Rupert can talk the talk. It's actually a difference between me and Julian as well. Julian can talk the talk. It's Labour that can actually deliver it. And that's the choice in 4 weeks' time. So the answer is yes, and let's do it.
Right, some quite sturdy criticism of your party's record on tax evasion and tax avoidance. Would you like to come back to that?
Well, I think Daniel answered the question himself. Under the Labour government, there wasn't enough of a move to clamp down on tax dodging. All I can say is, I'm not in Parliament yet. I'd like to be there. With your support, I can be there. And I feel I have the competence to really lead on an issue like this.
And Julian Hubbard, of course, your party in coalition with the Conservatives. Have you got a response to what Daniel said?
There's been billions collected. Billions and billions. Are there more billions to be collected? Absolutely. But when Daniel criticises the last Labour government for not doing anything, he is absolutely right on that. They created more gaps. It's interesting to hear the non-dom pledge because Tony Blair made the same thing 20 years ago. I think Daniel's message is that when Labour said it last time, they didn't mean it. this time trust them, which I find a little complex to see. I am absolutely committed to this. Many of my Lib Dem colleagues have been working on this bill. It is an absolute priority for us. It sounds like we will get somebody here who can do it. I think you might want somebody who's shown the track record in Parliament of trying to close these loopholes, trying to make sure people can't just dodge stamp duty. We have closed many of those gaps, but we have way more to go.
And with some implication that the Greens could be impotent, even if voted for. What do you think of that?
Well, Daniel says, let's elect a Labour government and then it'll deliver. Well, firstly, I think we all know that it's now pretty unlikely that any party will have a majority after this election. We're in a more mature era now of 4, 5, 6 party politics in this country. People are going to have to work together. And what I would like to see is a phalanx of Green MPs in the next Parliament, pushing perhaps Labour to be more radical and to actually deliver something worth delivering. Because if I've got the mood of this room here this evening right, on quite a lot of the topics that we're debating, there's a lot of sympathy for what I'm saying, a lot less keenness on what I'm saying. If you want to see a government that puts those things into action, well then you need to vote Green. So Daniel says Labour can deliver. If you did have a Labour majority government, we know from yesterday's manifesto what they would deliver. They would deliver just their own slightly kinder version of austerity. If you want to have an anti-austerity, pro-green alternative, you know who to vote for this election.
And Diana, just a quick chance for you to come back to the suggestion that, well, that you're saying it, but you won't actually do it.
I think it's a key moment. People in Cambridge, I'm absolutely sure, want a radical government. They do not want a Tory government. It's absolutely clear to me. And this is a key moment and a key decision. It's either going to be David Cameron or Ed Miliband who's going to be Prime Minister in 4 weeks' time. That's the choice. And frankly, as you look at the numbers, it's very hard to see how Labour becomes the largest party without winning seats like Cambridge. So I'm absolutely convinced that when Ed Miliband lays out these policies, particularly on things like non-doms and tax avoidance, as he has done when he stood up to Rupert Murdoch, as he has done when he stood up on Syria, as he has done when he's been brave on resisting the pressure for a referendum on Europe, that guy is tough, he means business, he's been underestimated all the way through. And if people want a radical alternative, it's your man.
Okay, well let's crack on to another question. Diana? Diana? Just there in the middle, left hand side. Thank you very much.
Is the current treatment of IS supporters returning to the UK from Syria, or an attempt to enter Syria, the best way to avoid acts of terrorism here? Or does it actually alienate people even further? And should a softer, more conciliatory approach be taken?
Diana, thank you. Rupert, would you like to start?
So, should a softer, more conciliatory approach be taken? Yes. The issue here is really quite clear from our point of view in the Greens. There's been a much too sort of judicial, injudicious approach taken to this issue. What we ought to be seeking to do is to like the prisoner votes question, to reintegrate these people into society. What we ought to be willing to do is to offer them the possibility of forgiveness and moving on. Some of them have been fooled and tricked with all sorts of promises, and I think we just sow the seeds of further radicalisation if we take an approach which is along the somewhat harsh lines that have currently been taken. To broaden out a little, we in the Greens believe passionately that in general our treatment of the situation in Syria and the surrounding areas has been insufficiently humane. In particular, it's an utter scandal that under this government, the number of Syrian refugees we've taken in this country has been in the hundreds, when in the surrounding countries it's in the millions. Right? We ought to be taking a we ought to be acting decently and humanely towards these people who are, in many cases, refugees because they stood up in a heroic attempt to battle against the appalling Assad dictatorship. As people flee from Assad on the one hand and IS on the other hand, let's be humane and let's, as you say, include very much within that those even who went over there as fighters. Thank you.
Daniel.
Well, I think we'll be careful about conflating a number of different issues there. I entirely agree with Rupert on the really very, very poor response in terms of Syrian people who should be seeking sanctuary here. But that's not quite the same as how we treat people who've gone to fight with IS coming back. And we do have to be careful, very, very careful, because some of those people who are coming back, yes, some of them did go over there and were tricked and were naive. And in that case, you treat them sensitively. But let's not get under any illusion that some people who've got some very, very dangerous views and who are very, very dangerous, and we've seen some of that on our streets in Britain, and the British public expect to be protected. So a careful balance has to be drawn. In the end, everything has to be done within the law. So you use the law appropriately. But the PREVENT programme, which Labour introduced to try and tackle radicalisation at source, I think has been devalued over the last few years. It's become much more a policing issue, and much less a community relations, community building, supportive approach. And we would change that back again. But we're under no illusion about the potential challenges here. But don't underestimate the risks, because there are some people out there who are fundamentally opposed to our values and our way of life. And we have to fight to protect that too.
Julian.
I mean, just to pick up the Syrian refugee question, I passionately believe we should be taking way more refugees. We are really letting people down. We can make a huge difference to people's lives. We are, I think, the biggest or second biggest contributors of aid to the area, and that's very helpful, helping people who are there. But we can and should do much, much more to bring Syrians here who need that help. People who are disabled, people who are multiple refugee, many, many groups like that. To come back to the question though, IS are a nasty, brutal group. There's no question about that. And to tackle it, we have to start to understand why it is that people feel disengaged with the UK. Why is it that people going out there in the first place? We have to do much more to understand what is leading to that. Why do people feel so annoyed? Is it British foreign policy over the years? I can see why. Is it discrimination that we have here? Is it the fact that things like PREVENT were seen as discriminatory, were seen as a way to control people from Islamic groups? What is it that we can do? And when people do come back from Syria, we shouldn't assume that they're all back for the same reasons. Some of them are nasty people who are coming here to try to kill people. People who are coming here to kill people, commit acts of terrorism, we have a legal system for that. If they should be found guilty of a crime like that, they should be found guilty of a crime like that. Fine, what's the process? If they made a mistake, we need to help them rehabilitate. If they went there to see friends, or to take aid to people in another part of the country, why do we want to have any sanctions whatsoever? So we need to have that much more proportionally. What I wouldn't do is to have things like control orders. Control orders were this thing which meant that people who had not been convicted of any crime could be moved anywhere in the country without a trial and be held under conditions pretty close to house arrest. The number of hours they were taken was reduced. To have that indefinitely is something which should never happen. We reduced that, so they call T-pins, which got rid of some of it, didn't go as far as I want to do. Because the place for somebody who wants to kill people is, after being found guilty, in a prison. Not...
We need to wrap up, Julian, if you would.
Not detained without a trial. That's a far more Soviet approach.
And Jamali.
Thank you very much for that question. I don't subscribe to a one-size-fits-all policy. I think you have to look at the individual, what their motivation was, and to go there in the first place and why they came back. And I think Julian articulated some of the points that I would also echo. There is the bigger issue of what it is that makes our youngsters feel either disenfranchised from the community they grow up in. Those 3 girls who went from Britain were all A-grade students. They were doing very well at school. What was it that motivated them to go out there? I've had a discussion not so long ago with the political editor of the BBC about televisation of the almost just the point before the beheadings, and when that actually helps radicalise people when they see someone in an orange jumpsuit with someone behind wearing black and wielding a weapon, or whether we need to know about what goes on. So there's a very fine balance in terms of the information we're putting out there. I do applaud the imams who've come out and said that they will be part of the propaganda war in a positive way, talking about the goodness of Islam, for example, on the internet, because we are increasingly finding that these youngsters who have been radicalised, it's not just occurred in community groups. They might be at home looking videos up on YouTube or listening to preachings that tell them that they have to go out and to kill people. So we need to look at what is it that motivates them, how we can help them much earlier, and I think you can only do that by working with them, listening to them, because often in society across the spectrum you find there are people who have problems that we don't get the chance to even scratch the surface of. And just to give one example.
We do need to wrap up very shortly.
The killers of Lee Rigby, one of the boys, his mother, either was a probation worker or she went to the probation services several times and said there was a problem with her son. And she didn't get the help and assistance she needed.
I think we'll have to leave it there if that's all right. Fair is fair. Tony has a question which will touch, I think, on some of the issues mentioned there with regard to Syria. We've got Tony Booth in the hall. There he is.
What should be our response to the deaths at sea of people fleeing wars in the Middle East and North Africa?
And Shimani, would you like to take that first?
This is a very serious issue, and thank you very much, Tony, for raising the question. I think it's absolutely tragic that things like this occur, and what is it that, again, what goes through people's minds, and why do they try and come here, and how can we help them? So we need to get our messaging right in terms of international messaging, and we need to be seen as a safe haven for people who are trying to flee a jurisdiction. And over and above that, how do we stop people dying at sea? It happens, take for example, Australia is another country where people are travelling to Australia, making that journey in the hope that they will have a better life, and then suddenly finding that everything has gone wrong and it's not how they at all imagined. That happens a lot in the world. So what are we going to do as a country? I think, again, it's international messaging, saying to people that we do have a policy, we welcome people who are fleeing a jurisdiction to come to this country, but also acting, we have a status of a global international actor, acting to help secure peace in other countries.
Rupert Reed.
Well, thanks for that important and moving question. As I've already indicated in my answer to the previous question, I think we need to have a fundamental attitude of humanity here, and we're just not seeing that at the moment. But I wonder if I may have already partially addressed the question in response to the previous question, to broaden it a little and say, I think it's absolutely crucial that we look at the root causes here. We have to look at the root causes. We can't always just be dealing with symptoms and effects. So what are the root causes of this kind of thing? Well, a key one is repressive regimes in the Middle East, which have then spawned revolutions against them. And who has propped up those repressive regimes over the years? Everyone in this room knows what the answer is, right? It's countries like this one. And so it's a classic case of, if you want to get to a good destination, then it would be better not to have started from here. But there is something we can do. We can stop making the same mistake again, right? We can stop supporting repressive regimes now and from now on. So one little example would be, we should put pressure, rather than having them as our best ally, countries like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, right? We should stop arms exports to Saudi Arabia. And Caroline Lucas MP has led the way in calling for that. And also we have to look even deeper and more fundamentally. There is plausible evidence now that one of the main drivers of the conflict in Sudan in the last generation, and of the Arab Spring, has been dangerous climate change and long-term droughts that have resulted from that. We have to rein in dangerous climate change, otherwise there are going to be more and more of these kinds of conflicts and appalling mass movements of people resulting from them. There is only one party in this election which is actually serious about addressing dangerous climate change and prioritising it heavily. If we don't address that kind of issue now, it will come back in the future to haunt us through things like mass movements of people and wars.
Thank you. Just a reminder of the question before we go to Daniel and then we'll go to Julian. What should be our response to the deaths at sea of people fleeing wars in the Middle East and North Africa? Daniel's actually.
The reaction is one of horror for any decent person, and I think it's probably the reaction of most people in this country. But it then leads to the next point about what you actually do about it. And I think one of the difficulties we have is that people aren't prepared to face up to that. Now, I think it's very important that we separate off those people who are fleeing, who are seeking sanctuary effectively, and we have international obligations, and we should abide by our international obligations. But of course, many people also see people moving across the world in terms of trying to improve their economic conditions, which is a slightly different thing, but still leads to the appalling scenes that we're seeing near Calais, for instance, on a regular basis. I think what all this adds up to is that the world is now a much, much more complex place. It's very different in the sense that with global communications, people can see other parts of the world in a way they never did before and are prepared to move. Where does that lead us to? I think it takes us right back to what I was talking about at the beginning, about how we see development and what we're actually doing with it, which is why conflict resolution is so important. It's also why actually having an internationalist perspective and actually signing up to things like some of the International Labour Organisation agreements and actually respecting them properly in a way that the Tories never have, and that was one of the first things they did when they came into government, was break away from some of those things again. Because while we've got economic injustice across the globe, we aren't going to get these flows of people. That is not going to be solved quickly. It's probably going to be the issue, one of the issues alongside climate change, as Rupert has rightly said, the issue of this century. So we need international cooperation, we need to be engaged, we do not need to be leaving the European Union and separating ourselves off from the rest of the world, but we do need to have an international perspective about global justice, because until people in the rest of the world have a reasonable standard of living, we are going to have these problems.
And a final answer on this question from Julian.
Jamali mentioned Australia. The last Australian elections, one of the main parties said we should maroon asylum seekers on a desert island. The other main party said, no, that's too liberal. It's a pretty horrific situation in Australia, and it's pretty horrific what's happening in the Mediterranean at the moment, with people drowning. And I think it is a disgrace that I think only Italy is putting any resources into trying to save people. This country, we had Theresa May saying repeatedly, I've pressed her on this and others have, saying that if we put in resources into rescuing people, it will just encourage more people to make the trip. The people who risk their lives going across the Mediterranean, they're not going because they've heard you can earn a slightly better job somewhere in Europe. They're going because of the disastrous situations that they're fleeing. And I agree with the comments. It's about countries' breakdown. It's about tyrannical regimes like Iran. It's about what we've done with oil. It's about climate change effects. It's a whole lot of things. But we have to tackle those. But we also have to think about the humanity of the people who are trying to get out. And I've heard some of their stories, and they are terrifying. It's not just the sea crossing. It's being trafficked across Africa, often dying on the way before you even get to the ocean. And I think we have a responsibility to sort out the overall picture, but also to save the lives of the people who are doing this. Part of that comes to having a decent asylum system. We do not have a decent asylum system in this country. We are incredibly slow at judging. For ages we've had a system which assumes that people are not telling the truth. It's true, this government is not good enough, the last government was not good enough at all. One of my constituents, to give you an idea, was an opposition politician in Iran. He converted to Christianity, which is a capital offence there, was tortured and sentenced to death. He somehow managed to get out and came here, and in 2008, 2009 I think it was, he applied for asylum. And it was rejected because there wasn't enough evidence he was actually at risk. It included a copy of the death sentence that had been passed against him. What more do you have to do to prove that you need help?
I don't think it's against law in Iran.
Iran, that's what I said.
You said Iran.
I think I said Iran.
Okay. Just a small plea from the candidates. They are drinking water like fish. All of this talking is making them thirsty. Is there any chance of getting a top up? Oh, it's not for me actually, but thank you very much. If there is a chance of a water top up, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. That's fine.
Our next question comes from Sue. Sue Woodson.
Are you aware that Britain has been, might have been, complicit in the use of torture through rendition? What would you do about it if you were elected? Would you follow up allegations and hold people to account?
Sue, thank you for the question. Rupert Reed of the Green Party, get started with this.
Well, the answer is yes. But once again, that's only the beginning, really. I think the really crucial thing we have to do here is ask ourselves how could this ever have happened in the first place, and ask ourselves how we can stop it from ever happening again. And I think what this is really about in the big picture is about changing the fundamental basis of our foreign policy commitments or orientation, right? We ought to move away from the historic block that we've been a part of in terms of, well, put it bluntly, being America's poodle. And we ought to, instead of that, seek to develop an orientation which is firstly a little bit more closely aligned with our European partners, and secondly, and more crucially, aligned to the actual needs of the vast majority of the population of the world, rather than towards selfish geopolitical ideas originating from within dark corners of the Foreign Office or similar places, dubious think tanks and so on, right? We ought to change our fundamental attitude in the world to one of being good global citizens. And that would mean that we wouldn't even begin to contemplate rendition for torture in the absolutely disgraceful way that we were, I think, absolutely clearly complicit with, especially under the Bush administration. So, the answer to your question, I think, is quite clear. Let's seek a way of doing things such that this kind of thing never happens again.
Julian.
I mean, emphatically, yes, as you know, we've spoken about this before, and I've called for an independent inquiry into rendition. I pushed very, very hard to see that. It is a disgrace that we're doing that. It is a black period of our history. Jack Straw will be remembered for his career ending in slightly different ways. But what happened was completely and utterly unacceptable. We have to know what happened and how to make sure it never happened again. What is also alarming is we have a Chilcot inquiry. Remember, that's going to tell us all about everything that's been conveniently delayed until after these elections again. Now, it should have started much, much earlier. Ming Campbell called for it at the beginning of the process. It took a long time to get more people on board. We still don't really know what happened, how we were lied to that illegal war in Iran, and that is not okay. And while things are a bit better now, they're not as good as they should be. There was a directive that went out from the government, one of the early things under this government, to say that if you're working overseas and you come across something which might lead to torture, you are not allowed to get involved in it. You're not allowed to do anything that might lead to that. And if it comes to cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, if you're sure that it's going to lead to it, you're also not allowed to. But if you just think it's really quite likely, you're allowed to. Now, the fact that we had to write over which say you're not allowed to torture, or do anything involved that might lead to torture, is shocking. We even had to say it. But to me, if you're working for the British government and you think there's even the slightest chance that what you do could lead to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, you shouldn't be doing it.
The Conservatives, Chimani.
Thank you. I think Julia made a very good point, actually. I would absolutely call people to account. I think we do need an investigation into it, and thank you very much for your question. There is a lot more to be done. In actual fact, writing a letter and telling people where the land lies, this is what you can and can't do, is the first part of educating our troops and soldiers abroad, or anyone that might be working abroad in any capacity. So, wholeheartedly, I would support an inquiry, and I firmly believe, and you'll see this through many threads, those of you who've been to previous Hustings events, about my passion for the rule of law, and no one is above the rule of law. And I think that we need to reinforce that principle, and that's something that I would like to work on in Parliament.
And Daniel Zeichner.
Well, let's start from the first point of principle. Torture is absolutely wrong. applaud. We're signed up to international conventions. The issue is what you do with states, of course, that don't abide by those conventions they've signed up to. I agree that it was a black period in our history, and I think there are many people in the Labour Party who feel very uneasy about the UK government's role in that. But of course we don't actually know exactly what did happen. And there's a danger of prejudging it when you're awaiting the inquiry results. I think Chilcot should have been published ages ago, and I think it would be much better if it had been. And I'd be very happy to press for an inquiry. What I would say is, I think some members have suggested with all these investigations and inquiries, we never really get to the bottom of it. But I think the lessons have been learned, and I think it's absolutely clear that we must make sure we must never get into that position again. And I think we've got to be very careful about our relationship with the United States. And I just hope that we're not find ourselves in a position where we are, in a sense, guilty by association in the future.
Now we have a question here which does not have a name on it. So I'll do my best to do it justice, if that sounds all right. And Daniel, you're going to be answering this first. 10 million Syrians displaced, 4 million Syrians outside the country. In the year since the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme came into effect, only 90 refugees have been allowed into the UK. The question, what do you think of this scandalous situation, Daniel?
It's a very good question. I think actually a number of us have already alluded to it. It's deeply depressing, isn't it? When the scale of the suffering in Syria is just unimaginable to us. You know, it's a country completely torn apart, and yet the world seems to carry on and shrug its shoulders. And I think the British tradition was to be generous and welcoming to people in this kind of situation. And I think we've let ourselves down. I think we've let everybody else down too. And Cambridge, of course, are good people in this city who try to run a campaign to make it possible for people to come here. I think it perhaps says something about us as a country that didn't get perhaps the response that we were all hoping for. And I think that's a shame, because I think actually Britain can be better than this. And I think we should be outward-looking in the future, and certainly on a scheme like this. I think the Labour government, and Yvette Cooper speaking for Labour, has been quite clear that we will push to take more people. And that may not be popular in every quarter, but it's the right thing to do, and actually we'll be a better country for it.
Who have we got next? Sorry, I've got a system here on my notepad, and it's maybe more complicated than it needs to be. Jamali Fernando.
Thank you very much. I believe it was said earlier on the panel that this country is one of the highest contributors of aid to Syria. So whilst we aren't taking that many people into Britain, we are trying to help them on the ground in Syria. There are a variety of other measures that ought to be looked at, and it perhaps touches on the question that another gentleman raised at the back of the room about what we can do in terms of asylum seekers. When I was much younger, Michael Heseltine proposed a sort of a sanctity within the British Embassy within various countries, so that people could go there first and make their claim for asylum, which would save them that horrendous journey that they're trying to make to get to Britain or to get to a safe haven. So that's something that maybe we should explore further.
Third on this, Julian Edwards.
I've said in Parliament that I think what's happened is tokenistic. I think it is a disgrace. There are countries all around Europe, not as rich as us, not as large as us, who are taking way more people. There are two things which we've done which are good. The aid amount is very, very good. We should be proud of the aid we're providing into that region. That is a good thing. We've also been actually reasonably good at granting asylum to people from Syria who can make it here themselves. There's quite a lot, I think a couple of thousand people. They come from Syria, got here, then we're looking after them. But we are abandoning the people most in need. Because by definition, the people who can fly here from Syria have some resources. They're not the people in most need. I spoke earlier about people who are disabled. People who are not to be refugee. That's people who, for example, may have been Palestinians, who were refugees from Palestine, found themselves eventually in Syria, now find themselves kicked out to another country. Completely bereft, completely separated. Those are people who should help. Orphans. There's a whole range of people where we should be going in and helping them. We can't take millions of people. That's what it is. So providing, and we as a country should be so much better at providing health and behaviour like that. There is so much more to talk about the right to work, but we have a duty to the world.
And Rupert Reed.
Yeah, well, we've failed our Syrian brothers and sisters. We've failed them most grievously. It's atrocious. I feel very strongly about this, partly because of how pathetically we failed them in this country, partly also because I spent a lot of time in the past in Syria. I spent time in Palestinian refugee camps in Syria, travelled all over the country, and the country has been essentially destroyed. We could have played more constructive roles in trying to stop that from happening. When the Syrian people rose up with incredible heroism against the unbelievable torturing, butchering regime of the police state of Assad, we should have offered them more support. In particular, we should have offered them at an early stage humanitarian support. There's a sort of reasonable amount of humanitarian aid getting there now, although there should still be more. But it was very, very slow in coming, and that was a terrible failure. If we'd have directed that humanitarian aid to places where people were rising up and into rebel-held areas, we might have stopped the growth and support for Al-Qaeda and IS.
Would you have voted for military intervention?
I'm sorry?
Would you have voted for military intervention?
No, I wasn't in favour of military intervention in Syria, but what I think there was a case for is for militarily supported humanitarian aid to be delivered into parts of Syria, because otherwise what you had was the government starving people out and really just unbelievably atrocious conditions. So I think that, as I said in answer to the previous question on this, we need to do so much better in terms of supporting Syrian refugees. And we also need to think much more cleverly about how to stop there being more such refugees in the future.
Rupert, thank you for that. Now, we are getting towards having about a quarter of an hour left, so we've got time probably for a couple more questions. Takia. Takia in the room? No? Okay, I will read out this question in that case, which comes from here. If everybody has the rights to a fair trial, why is the legal aid budget always being cut? And if you were elected, would you vote for further cuts? Julian Hubbard, in a definite this month.
Well, the simple answer to the last bit is no. We can't cut legal aid anymore. What I would do is to try to get a lot more money in from particular sources. So two things in particular I've been working on, and will be in our manifesto tomorrow. One of them is about using assets from the Mr. Bigs, people with large resources. At the moment, we restrain their assets so that they can't spend any of their money on a lawyer, so we have to give them legal aid. Now, that seems a bit silly, they have lots of money, and what's remarkable about them is, although the money is supposed to come back afterwards if they're convicted, they strangely never seem to be able to find any of the money. And I suspect if we told them they could use some of it for their own defence, they'd remarkably be able to find all that cash. So that's one source. The other source is directors' insurance against fraud. Between the two of those would provide the extra money that's needed to pick up the legal aid system. But to go back to the first bit, it is a great shame that there was a cross-party agreement that we need to cut back on legal aid. The Labour manifesto was actually very explicit, saying, in order to avoid cuts to the front line, we will cut legal aid. Find savings in legal aid, I think was the wording. The piece of legislation, LASPO, I actually refused to vote for it, because I was concerned about what would happen. So it passed nonetheless, but I do not think we can cut anymore, because people do need to be able to get that fair trial, and that's why I've identified extra money that could go in to support that.
Daniel Ashton.
I think it cuts the legal aid budget of being one of the most disgraceful things that's gone on in this Parliament, quite frankly. It's a key part of the welfare state, access to justice for people. And the kind of level of cuts we've seen, I think, have been totally unnecessary and counterproductive. Let me give you an example. I've talked at length to people who work in the family mediation unit in Cambridge, and they've been explaining to me what's been happening in the courts, which is basically the self-representation. The courts are getting increasingly clogged up. It's taking longer. The costs rise. In other words, you don't actually save money through this. But what you do is you cause huge hardship for people, particularly around cases of domestic violence. I'm really pleased to say that Labour's made it very clear that around domestic violence, we will be restoring services to to make it possible for people to have access to the services they need. So it's a very big issue. I don't think it's had nearly the attention it's deserved. I have to say, I think Julian's voting record is slightly more complex on this than he's presented, but you can go away and look at that for yourself. But certainly, for Labour, we will be looking at ways of restoring access to justice. We know we can't find any money immediately, but we haven't talked about the wider economic issues today. But I would just say to you, as the economy recovers, there's a big choice, and the Conservatives will cut taxes, and Labour will put money into public services. That's the choice. So if you want better legal aid in the future, you know what to do.
Rupert.
Well, I'm not sure they do know quite what to do yet, Daniel, on the basis of what you just said. I was very interested in your phrase, we know we can't find the money immediately. Let's be clear about what you're being offered in the three manifestos at this election of the main parties, so-called main parties. You're being offered three different, marginally differing varieties of austerity. No, that's the brutal reality, Daniel. If you actually looked at your own party's manifesto that was published yesterday, you would have seen that it contained on the front a massive commitment to austerity, and it contained just these very, very little commitments within to bits of spending here and there. What Emma Lind is absolutely desperate to do now, contrary to what you said earlier, seems to be to reassure Middle England and to reassure business. There are three pro-austerity manifestos at this election and one anti-austerity manifesto, and that is the Green Party manifesto. And what we're saying is, let's cut Trident, let's cut subsidies to nuclear, let's cut subsidies to fossil fuel, let's bring in a wealth tax, let's bring in a land value tax, let's have enough money in the pot so that we can actually do all the good things that we want to do, and they can be done if you make those kind of cuts and impose those kind of taxes on the rich. So, in the Green Party manifesto that was launched today, we had a big upfront commitment to increasing the legal aid budget. That is the only manifesto in which you will find such a commitment to this election, whatever Julian or Daniel may tell you. And why? Well, because, as Daniel correctly implied, access to justice is a fundamental. Very interesting poll the other day suggests that people actually care about it, and some, if you ask the question a certain way, more even than they care about the NHS. Access to justice is absolutely fundamental for a civilized society. We in the Green Party are the only ones who are actually saying in our manifesto, we will find the money for it.
Thank you very much for that question. Successive governments have cut legal aid from all angles since I was a child. And I grew up in a family where my father ran a law firm, one department of which was a legally aided criminal law department. And there you saw people who were facing jail and consequently may have been suspended from work or may have even lost their job, unable to afford protection, the right to a fair trial because they weren't able to get legal aid and they weren't able to fund that case themselves. So there's lots of reasons why we need to improve our access to justice in this country. What you get from me is someone who actually understands the legal aid budget in quite considerable detail and the practical level that it has on the ground and how it affects people. I have worked very closely with contract managers in the Legal Services Commission. An example of wastage actually is how much contract managers get paid vis-a-vis how much the junior bar might get paid. There are contract managers who've had 2 weeks of legal training getting nearly £8,000 more than a junior barrister. I know people must think barristers, gosh, they must have loads of money. Actually, at the junior end of the bar, there are some real scandals going on. And what it results in is a client who might have had a particular solicitor or a particular representative for much of their life, suddenly being told, well, no, you can't have that one. You have to have either whoever's coming in through a criminal defence service or whoever we allocate to you. And I think there's some real injustices in the system. It does actually need a huge overhaul, and it needs someone who has that detailed understanding of the places in which we can make cuts, but still maintain access to justice. Another example of wastage of money, the Legal Aid Board, I think in the 2000s, changed its name and rebranded to the Legal Services Commission. What on earth for? You tell a client today about the Legal Services Commission, they don't know that you're talking about the Legal Aid Board.
And we'll have to leave it there on the French of July. Thank you very much for that answer. So we are moving on towards wrapping up, really. I'm not going to ask for closing statements, from the candidates. But a lot of the questions that we've dealt with have been very, very specific. So I thought I would just ask you all a slightly more general question. It's looking very much like whoever we all vote for in Cambridge, the party in government is likely to be in a coalition government of whatever type. So for the purposes of this answer, you can pretend that I'm the UK Independence Party and I'm joining you at the table here. Okay. UKIP, by the way, they were invited, no one available any night this week. But if you had to make a coalition with one of the other parties at this table, and I am donning my UKIP hat for the purposes of this question, who would it be? And Shamali, we'll start with you. I'll find question.
Thank you very much. Certainly not with UKIP, sorry. I would like to see an overall majority Conservative government. We have demonstrated through this Parliament our ability to work together with another party, but that's not, in my view, the way we want to go forward. We have a bright future in this country. We are the fastest growing economy in Europe. We have lifted 1.1 million people out of the income tax threshold altogether. We've invested 12.9 billion in the UK. So we've managed to achieve things, and I think we can achieve a lot more if we are in an overall majority Conservative government.
But if you had to, who would it be?
Well, we have demonstrated the ability to work with the Liberal Democrats, but we can't have Julian because I'm hoping that you will elect me. So.
Okay. Rupert, to take this next. Final answer for you.
Yeah, so the first point I'd like to make is it won't necessarily be a coalition. What we've said in the Greens is that we're very unlikely to enter into a coalition with anybody. What we'd much more like to do is enter into what's technically called a confidence and supply arrangements, which means that you don't get any ministerial salaries and cars, but you do get to keep your conscience. It means that you support the government on their overall proposition and support their budgets, but you take each other vote, each other issue on a case-by-case basis. Now, what party would you be most likely to go into on that basis? So we've already said as a red line that you rule out UKIP. What we've also said is that we are very unlikely to do any kind of deal whatsoever with the Conservatives. We've essentially ruled them out too. So that leaves Labour and the Liberal Democrats and the SNP and everybody else. And I think there is a reasonable possibility that we might have some kind of progressive Rainbow Alliance confidence supply arrangement after this election. If that does happen, we will be pressing for action on the issues I've outlined this evening. Stopping Trident, serious support for Palestine, serious action on climate change, anti-austerity, and other issues we haven't talked about. Most strikingly, we'll be pressing to stop the horrendous anti-democratic TTIP treaty. If the Labour Party are interested in having such discussions with us, and for that matter the Liberal Democrats, then we'll be very interested to have such discussions with them.
Daniel Zeister.
Well, I can say with absolute confidence is I won't be backing up the Tories. Absolutely, certainly wouldn't be backing up the Conservative government. So, what's going to happen? I actually don't think they'd be productive trying to second guess what will happen after elections. But what I would say is if it ends up with a very fragile, unstable set of agreements, I think what will happen is it will fall apart, and we will then probably face a second election. And if it happens again, we're in very dangerous territory indeed. And in those circumstances, what you'll begin to see more likely is I think UKIP doing better. So I would say far better to make a sensible choice at the outset. And just one final point I'll remind you, an awful lot of the issues tonight have actually been global, international. Let's look at an international lesson from a few years ago. An American presidential election, some of you will remember, when Al Gore, a decent man, was beaten by George Bush. And the reason he lost that election by a handful of votes of hanging chads was because too many people of the progressive side of American politics couldn't bring themselves to vote for Al Gore, they voted for Ralph Nader. We ended up with George Bush, and that's what happens if you don't make a sensible decision.
Daniel, thank you very much. Julian Hubbard.
Well, firstly, I think like everyone else here, I wouldn't go into a coalition with UKIP. The party I'd most like to go into a coalition with would be the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland. But I suspect the chance of us then being enough for majorities is fairly slim. I do hope they keep their one seat there. I think it's unlikely to be, I think it's right that it almost certainly won't be a majority coalition, it may be some other sort of arrangement, I don't know. I've worked with MPs from pretty much every party. I've worked with Tories constructively, I've worked with Labour MPs constructively, I've worked with every single one of the Green MPs constructively. In fact, Caroline and I have worked together on a whole lot of things. I'd be very happy to continue that in the future. I hope she gets re-elected, and obviously I hope I get re-elected. But I think the real message is not the sort of old two-party thing that Daniel pushes, that you have to be blue or red, the old pendulum swing between one side or the other. It's that we're likely to be in a position where there is no overall majority, there's no one party. So what matters most is that you vote for the person you want to represent you here in this constituency. Do you want somebody like me who actually has a track record of delivering money to schools, to hospitals, who's actually championed many of these issues in Parliament? I don't have to promise you I'll vote against Trident, I have. I won't promise you that I'll vote against Syrian military intervention, Iraq military intervention, I did. I don't have to promise you I'll vote for prisoners to be allowed to vote, because I did. Is that what you want?
Well, thank you very much to all of the candidates. You've heard from Daniel Zeichner of the Labour Party, Rupert Reid of the Green Party, Julian Huppert of the Lib Dems, and Shamali Fernando of the Conservatives. Thank you very much to the groups who have organised this event. Thank you to you for all of your questions. Just a reminder that there is going to be a bucket collection at the back of the church as you leave. The event obviously has been free for you to come to. The collection will be used to pay for the expenses and also any surplus will go to Amnesty International. And if you listen to BBC Radio Cambridgeshire, I will see you tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock.
Thank you to Flores on sound at the back. Thank you to the candidates. I've been lucky in Cambridge to have such articulate and thoughtful candidates, whatever their differences. And a particular thanks to Dottie, who was on Radio Cambridgeshire some unearthly hours going and has shared good humour and thoughtfulness. And she said that she was worried because our previous two hustings had been chaired by the legendary, she calls him Andy Harper. Well, she's in danger of being asked again, because I think she's well on the way to